We love our universities, but what's happening now is that we're all trying to kind of do university while two megatrends are making it much harder. They're interfering with what we do on campus. They're interfering with many institutions in American society. One is the mental health crisis, and the other is polarization. Everywhere I go, all across the country, anybody working with teenagers or young adults says the same thing, that there's been a surge in the rate of anxiety and depression. Every campus mental health center is overwhelmed. They can't hire therapists fast enough. But as you dig into the statistics, what you see is something truly scary. First, we have to understand that college students today are not millennials. They are Gen Z. Born in 95 had a different childhood and have turned out different than the millennials. So this shows the rates at which teenage Americans hit certain milestones or engage in certain kinds of behaviors. And so this is the percentage of 12th graders who have a driver's license. Nowadays, a lot of kids don't even bother to get one. They don't care. They don't need one. They're not going out very much because, for one thing, many of them have never even drunk alcohol or gone out on a date or had a job for pay. And so if you're not doing any of these things, you don't really need a car. And if you're not doing any of these things, what are you doing? Video games, that's right. So for the boys, video games. For the girls, social media is what fills up a lot of the time. So basically devices. Gen Z got these really intense, amazing, wonderful devices in middle school or earlier, whereas the millennials didn't get them until college or later. So that, we think, is one of the main reasons for the generational difference. Here's what has been the result. So if we look at rates of major depression, these are teenagers who said yes to 5 out of 9 symptoms on a symptom checklist. What we see is that from 2004 to 2010, the rates were fairly constant. Girls have higher rates of depression and anxiety. Boys have higher rates of alcoholism, violence, things that make other people miserable. And what we see is that when Gen Z enters the picture, the rate for boys does go up as a percentage. That actually is a substantial increase. But clearly, it's affected girls more. The rates of depression and anxiety have gone way up for girls and more moderately up for boys. When we look just on college campuses, just college students, representative survey, what we see is that in 2012, when everybody on campus was a millennial, the percentage of students who said, yes, they have a psychological disorder, and it was up to them to label it, but the percentage who self-identify as having a psychological disorder was very low for women and men. But now college is all Gen Z. They have much, much higher rates of believing that they have a mental disorder, and it's mostly depression and anxiety. Some great work done here at Penn State. You have an institute that collects information from all the counseling centers around the country. Why are so many students going into the counseling center? What is the reason that they report when they come in through the front door? And the reason, as you can see, going back to 2013, 2014 to the present, the only things that are going up are anxiety and depression. Nothing else is rising. It's not even stress. Gen Z does not claim to be more stressed than a previous generation. They just never got the chance to learn how to deal with normal, ordinary, everyday stress. And I'll explain why later. So as I mentioned, there is some skepticism. This was in the New York Times a few months ago. Richard Friedman saying, relax, there is no epidemic, and there's no harm caused by devices. Your kids playing video games, your kids spending hours and hours a day on devices, relax. The only evidence that it's harming them is self-report. These surveys that show that they say that they're more depressed, but they're just more comfortable talking about it. That's his argument in the New York Times. But I believe that he is wrong, and here's why. This is data on the percentage of boys. Now, for boys, there's no change. But this is data on the percentage of boys, or the number of boys out of 100,000 in the population who are admitted to a hospital each year for cutting themselves or otherwise harming themselves so severely that they required hospitalization. And so, as you see, the youngest boys, age 10 to 14, almost never do that. So the rates are low for boys compared to the girls, which you'll see in a moment. And for boys, there's been no change as we go from 2001 to 2015. But look at the rates for girls. Much, much higher. Now here, I've cut it off at 2009. Much, much higher. This is a manifestation of an anxiety disorder. Self-harm is a product of anxiety disorders. Much higher rates for girls and young women, as you see. But look what happens after 2009. What you see is that for the older teenage girls, the rate has increased 62%. This is not self-report. This is not just changing diagnostic criteria. These are hospital admissions. Now, interestingly, the oldest group here, who are millennials in this data set, the millennials were not affected because, as I said, they got social media when they were in college and later, and there's not much evidence that it was harmful in college. I believe, I'm working on a lit review now, there's debate about this, but my conclusion from going through the data is that the problem is getting social media in middle school, and that's a problem especially for girls. Look what happens to the youngest girls. Age 10 to 14 girls, they didn't used to cut themselves, but their rate has gone up 189% since they got social media in middle school. Again, I can't prove causality, but I have a lit review online, which I'm working on, which is available. If you go to thecoddling.com, I'll post it there tomorrow. I think the evidence does point to social media as being the reason for the huge sex difference in what has happened to teenagers. It also shows up in suicide. So the suicide rate was it was higher for males in the 80s and 90s when there was a huge crime wave and a lot of violence, but it's been stable in the 2000s until recently. So for males, it's up 25%. Now, it turns out most age groups in America are going up. Suicide is going down around the world, but it's going up in America for almost all age groups, both sexes. So the rise for boys is actually not much more than what's happening to older men. But the rise for women, while it's higher than for men overall, for 15 to 19-year-old girls, it's up 70%, which is much higher. And for 10 to 14-year-old girls, who have a very low base rate, but for them, again, the increase is gigantic, 151% increase in preteen girl suicides in this country. So something is going wrong, especially for girls. 2015 hit a peak higher than ever recorded before since we've been collecting data, and the 2 years after that are right about the same level, so it was not a one-year spike. So that's the first megatrend. The second trend I want to talk about is political polarization. So about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a debate as to whether America was becoming more polarized. Everybody agreed that we had elite polarization. So if you look at Congress, if you look at the media, if you look at the intellectual leaders, those who were in the fray, everyone agreed that in the 80s and 90s we had elite polarization. What you see here is the degree to which the US Congress is polarized. Going back to 1880, a calculation, to what extent can you predict everything about major votes if all you know is where a particular legislator is on the left-right spectrum? If that allows you to predict, and then you can predict the two parties are far apart, then Congress is very polarized, just like straight party voting on a left-right dimension. And so in the wake of the Civil War, it was horribly polarized. It was, and then for a variety of reasons, it plummets in the mid-20th century, and we have this period of very low polarization where there was a lot of bipartisanship. So there's a lot of reasons for that. But what I want to point out is that that was an anomaly. It was a temporary period. And what's happened since the 1980s is this. So the US Congress is more polarized than it has ever been, or at least it's at the level that it was right after the Civil War. It's dysfunctional. It's very hard to reform. It is ineffective as a legislature. So that's elite polarization. It's also now clear, I think the argument is settled, that we also have mass polarization. If you keep your eye on especially what we think about each other, how much we hate each other, but even if you look at what we think about the issues where it's harder to see, Pew has been studying American attitudes on a whole bunch of items. They were able to go back to 1994 and look at to what extent are different demographic groups different on their attitudes to these issues. And here's what they find. So the way to read this is, let's look at gender. If you take this basket of 10 items and you take the absolute value of the difference between male and female, back in 1994, on this basket of items by gender, it was 8 or 9 points apart. And now it's 7 points apart. So on gender, there's been no change. Men and women are not further apart on this basket of issues. But if you look at religious attendance, it's 11 points apart now. It used to be only 5 points apart. So Americans are now twice as far apart. We are coming apart by religious attendance. If you know whether someone goes to church regularly, you can predict something about their attitudes. But that increase is nothing compared to what has happened to are polarization by party. And most of this, as you see, is just since around 2004. So polarization has been rising since the 1980s, but it is really rising in the last 10 or 15 years. Something is happening that is very, very bad for our democracy, for our ability to work together, trust each other, compromise. So why is this happening? I wrote an article with a political scientist, Sam Abrams. I won't go into these reasons. My point is there are a lot of historical trends. The late 20th century was an anomaly. In a sense, we had a lot of things going for us. We took it for granted. We thought democracy was easy. We thought now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, clearly this is the end of history. All societies, as they develop, will become like the United States or like Sweden or some sort of Western democracy. We thought it was easy. We took it for granted. We were wrong. Most of these trends cannot be reversed. It doesn't mean that things are hopeless. It just means it's going to be really, really hard to turn this thing around. Passions really rose, especially in 2016, 2017, and this is now where we come back to campus. There was a huge rise in shout-downs and disinvitations, all sorts of things happening in the 2016, 2017 academic year. And the inauguration of the president was actually a spur that sort of raised the temperature on campus especially. And so while there's been, thank God, very little violence on campus, most of the real violence occurred in the few months after the inauguration when passions were very high. So the bloodiest event was at UC Berkeley. A lot of people were injured. It's incredible no one was killed. And we tell the story in the book, in the Coddling the American Mind. I mean, it's amazing how many people were injured without being killed. So that was Berkeley. At Middlebury was another of the spectacular cases where a professor was assaulted. She was accompanying Charles Murray. That's Charles Murray on the front. They wouldn't let him speak, and when he and the other professor tried to leave the building, they were attacked. She has a concussion and possibly permanent neck damage as well. There's been a wave of activism of students who, especially in the last couple of years, think that they can go into classes and shout and protest to shut things down if they object to what is happening. So there was a lot of that in 2015 to 2017. It declined quite a lot in 2018. So at least those shout downs and the violence is way down, thankfully, in the last year. But it's left in its wake a new moral and political culture on many campuses. And that's what our book is about. That's what I mostly want to talk to you about. So what has happened is just since 2014, we've seen the emergence on many campuses. It's not very much here, but it's at most liberal arts schools in the Northeast and the West Coast. It's scattered around the whole country. But what is a new culture that we call a culture of safetyism? It's an idea that students think of themselves and they think of people as very, very fragile, and they see the world and the campus as very, very dangerous, and therefore they need protection from words or violence, and they need protection from certain kinds of words, books, speakers, and ideas. So if you see on many campuses in America, you do see if you see a bunch of these terms together, they always travel together. If people are talking about safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, bias response teams, America's a matrix of oppression, you get a call-out culture, and it's often focused on single words. There's a real reactivity to a single word. These are the features of this new moral culture. So what I'd like to do is analyze that for you. That's what our book is about with Greg Lukianoff. Why it happened suddenly, why it came out of nowhere in 2017. Again, I won't go through all the reasons. I guess I like to make lists of reasons. I'm a social scientist. Everything's complicated. Everything has multiple causal threads. So political polarization and rising anxiety, those are the two that I'm talking to you about. But a lot is because of the way we changed our child rearing in the 1990s, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The student body is changing, times are changing, all sorts of things are changing, and a lot of us don't know what to do. And so we end up being caught like deer in the headlights and implementing policies that are not based on research. I hope that the things here and the things in the book will help ground empirically grounded reforms and policies.